You should always, 100% of the time, do what I just did. So, you know, I got a letter in my inbox today, and this came my way because I had a very lengthy phone call because the internet was down yesterday morning, and I ended up having to call, you know, Xfinity on the phone. And when I was on the phone with them, they tried to upsell me on new services. And I mentioned, that I had tried to use Xfinity Call Guard, which was this new application that I ended up finding, and that Call Guard service, I found it, I think, when I was searching in the store for the Xfinity app, but I found this Call Guard service in it, in the Play Store, and it showed up, and, I installed it, and then I tried to log into it, and it basically said that, your account isn't set up for this, and so it was like $10 a month more to sign up for premium services, which they would do call guard, which means that now I don't get nuisance calls, I don't get robo calls, to the extent that those people are on the Xfinity filter, at least, those calls will now be blocked, and so I won't be getting all this, all these junk calls, that are completely unsolicited and everything to the same extent. But, I find this to review the updated agreement. So, you know, these changes take place November 15th, 2005. So it basically says we've made some updates to our Xfinity Mobile customer agreement, including changes to the arbitration provisions. And I'm sitting there, reading that, and I'm thinking, oh God, not this shit again. But I get it, and I see it, and I want to tell you, people, legal advice. Consult a lawyer about this, but to confirm what I'm saying. But you should always opt out, always. You know, I see it and I'm like, not this bullshit again. Well, let's just keep scrolling until we find it. So I pull up the contract, and it's 6 pages of bullshit. Not all that much, but I why read all of it when you can just search for terms. So at first I used a hyphen between the opt out, but I found it in this, and it's what in the contract and everything, and it says the right to opt out. If you do not wish to arbitrate disputes, you can decline to have your disputes arbitrated with us by notifying us within 30 days of your service activation by visit. And so, I'm like, well, this was just yesterday, that I upgraded services with them and went over to premium, unlimited, premium unlimited with them. And so I went and visited, arbitration opt-out mobile. And at first it errored out on me, so I had to go and fill this form out again in Chrome, because I'm filtering too much in my extensions. But see, with my extensions, but look at this. This is so I went in Paint and I altered this image so that I don't end up leaking information to you. But I filled the form out, I checked the box, I went in, filled it out, and then after I filled it out, I get this response from from them, which is, we've received your opt-out selection. And I'm like, they know most people aren't gonna go through these things. Most people won't do this. But like I said, I mean, if you want to be, smart about things, Control F on your keyboard, at least if you're a Windows user, is very convenient. And however you find within your browser, that you use, look it up, the find command, anyways, and just search for opt out, or opt hyphen out, just do some intelligent digging to mine the contracts to find out how you essentially opt out. But I opted out 1 day later, immediately as I got the email. I'm thinking the odds that I will find a reason to sue Xfinity Mobile are astronomically low, but just in case, just in case, so I get this, and I decided to opt out. You never know what might happen in life. It's like insurance, opting out of these things. So I I think it sucks, and as a critic of these kinds of laws in the first place, I object to the very nature of these contracts, these types of contracts, because, you know, you accept this agreement in any of the following ways: by agreeing in writing, by email, or over the phone, or by in person, by activating your service or device. So, basically, by doing that in the first place, now I have to go through the hassle, you know, using the service, paying for acquiring the service, creating Xfinity Mobile or Xfinity Mobile online identity with your account. If you purchase a device from us and you have not returned that device pursuant to our return policy, you will be deemed to be using your service and to have accepted this agreement, even if you fail to activate the service. When you accept this agreement, you are representing that so basically, they do everything they possibly can to make it so that, it's on their side and that they can force you into these stupid binding arbitration agreements that never favor the little guy in the dispute. They always favor the giant corporation at the end of the day. That's the nature of arbitration. It always favors them over you, and that's why they do it. But at this time, they're doing everything they possibly can, and part of what pisses me off is that this has become so normalized. This is not exceptional. All the tech companies are doing it, every single one of them. It's not as if this is especially egregious. In fact, if anything, Xfinity is actually better as an actor for the whole thing, because they have this way of disputing the whole process. It's going to this website and everything that's buried, 4 pages down in the contract. But at least, unlike with Nintendo, I don't have to send, there's an alternative to sending them a registered letter for the whole thing and to opt out. I've got registered letters with, Nintendo, and, I've opted out with Samsung as well when I got the phone from them, the device from them. So I opted out with Samsung, when that came in the mail, and I opted out with Nintendo several months ago when I got my Switch 2. And everything, and I've been opting out now every time I get one of these, actually, looking at the contract, looking for the opt-out provisions, because they're usually there. They're usually, there. So anyways, the whole thing, it pisses me off, and this has become so normalized. I mean, they do a process where, now you don't have to opt into arbitration, which you should have to. They get all kinds of loopholes, I guess, where they can cheat, as far as, opting in, where you just opt in automatically because of the fact that you signed up for services, or, you upgraded services, or you changed the contract with them in some way, or you took it, and, by that admission alone, you're assumed to have agreed until you go through the process of, finally updating the agreement and telling them, no, look, I don't actually consent to any of this. And you've got 30 days of this activation. So I just activated Premium Unlimited with them, so I decided ultimately to go through the opt-out process with them, and you should likewise retain your full rights and dignity in these kinds of things, and to do this. And I would advocate that anybody do this. You all should. It's a bit of a hassle to do, but like I said, I'm also looking into the possibility of getting a new scanner that can be fed multiple documents at once to digitize contracts in person and then run them through OCR, technology, in order to, to make the contract searchable, with a computer, and to mine them easier. That was 6 pages, and obviously, hitting Control F and pulling up the search dialog to find the opt-out provision made this a little bit more convenient than it ultimately is. And like I said, Xfinity isn't the worst offender here. The worst possible way of handling this is to make people send you a letter in the mail, and by snail mail, to do this. I mean, the people that do that suck. It's really not surprising that Xfinity is actually behaving better than Nintendo here. Nintendo gotta hand it to them. They don't have the best reputation, to say the least. They've a lot of people have a grudge against them. They have a tendency, my own. They have a tendency to sue people that use their intellectual property, you know, in a very respectful fashion. People that aren't really trying to step on Nintendo's toes. They use their characters or reuse them somewhere else, and Nintendo goes after them for that, for like fan art and fan creations and spin-offs of their work and intellectual property. They are overly zealous in terms of copyright infringement lawsuits and everything. They're very a little bit too much so in that direction, and it soured their reputation for among a lot of people. Nintendo does have its merits, though. It does pay its employees well. We have to give its treatment, of its own employees a lot of credit, a lot. But still, they are a company that is a little bit overly zealous on suing people who work there. Wouldn't don't like the way that they sue people all the time, and everything. And I think that they're a little bit overly zealous in that department. But like I said, I now have changed. I used to be the sort of person that would get a letter like this and just delete it and not look at it and not look at the details here. But ever since I learned about forced, and binding arbitration agreements and everything, and I learned about arbitration, I decided to actually jump through these kinds of hoops. And obviously this is another call to action. If you have the time on your hands, or you don't, keep in mind that it's just a matter of pulling up the contract and hitting Control F, to find where the opt-out process is,